Welcome to my channel. Tonight, I'm sharing 2 creepy true 7th of July horror stories. Real tales that will chill you to the bone. Are you ready to discover what lurks in the shadows on this haunted date? The town of Willow's End had always celebrated the 7th of July with a peculiar reverence. Unlike the fireworks and fanfare of the 4th, this day was marked by somber gatherings, flickering lanterns, and whispered prayers. The townsfolk claimed it was tradition, a ritual passed down since the settlement's founding in 1787. Outsiders, however, found the air heavy, as if the very earth remembered something it wished to forget. On the morning of July 7, 1998, Emma Caldwell returned to Willow's End after nearly a decade away. She'd left for college in Boston, vowing never to return, but her mother's sudden illness forced her back. The town seemed unchanged. The same moss-covered gravestones in the churchyard, the same crooked oaks lining Main Street, and the same wary glances from neighbors who remembered her as the girl who asked too many questions. Emma's childhood home sat at the edge of the woods, its white paint peeling, the porch sagging under years of neglect. Her mother, Ruth, was frail but lucid, her eyes bright with unspoken worry. "You came back on the wrong day?" Ruth whispered as Emma unpacked her bags. "You know what tonight is." Emma forced a smile. "It's just another day, Mom. Nothing's going to happen." But as dusk fell, the familiar unease crept in. The town's lanterns were lit, casting trembling shadows on the cobblestone streets. Emma remembered her father's warnings from years ago. Never look out the window after midnight on the 7th. Never answer a knock at the door. And never, ever follow the lights into the woods. The warnings seemed absurd now, childish superstitions. Yet as the clock inched toward midnight, Emma found herself unable to sleep. She sat by her window, watching the lanterns sway in the wind, their glow barely piercing the thickening mist. At exactly 12:01 a.m., a sharp knock echoed through the house. Emma froze. Her mother stirred in the next room, muttering prayers under her breath. The knock came again, louder this time, insistent. Against her better judgment, Emma crept down the hallway, her footsteps muffled by the worn rug. She peered through the peephole, expecting to see a neighbor or perhaps a prankster. Instead, she saw nothing, just the swirling fog and the faint outline of the woods beyond. Another knock, this one accompanied by a whisper, "Emma?" Her heart hammered in her chest. She recognized the voice. It was her father's, but he'd been dead for 10 years. Trembling, Emma backed away from the door. The whisper came again, closer now, as if the voice had slipped through the cracks in the wood. "Emma, let me in." She stumbled to her mother's room, desperate for comfort. Ruth was sitting upright, eyes wide with terror. "Don't answer," she hissed. "It's not him. It's never him." The knocks grew frantic, rattling the windows and shaking the walls. Emma clung to her mother, the old fears flooding back. She remembered the stories. How every 7th of July, someone in Willow's End vanished without a trace. How the woods claimed those who dared to follow the lights. Suddenly, the lanterns outside flickered and died, plunging the house into darkness. The whispers multiplied, voices overlapping, pleading, cajoling. Emma squeezed her eyes shut, praying for dawn. When she opened them, the house was silent. The first rays of sunlight filtered through the curtains, painting the room in gold. Emma crept to the front door, half expecting to find it battered or broken. Instead, she found a single lantern on the porch, its flame still burning. Inside was a scrap of parchment, scrawled with a message in her father's handwriting. "You can never leave." Emma's scream echoed through the empty streets, mingling with the morning mist. She realized then that Willow's End was not a town you could escape. It was a place that remembered, a place that waited. And every 7th of July it claimed what was owed. Emma's scream faded into the morning air, but the terror lingered in her chest. She clutched the parchment, its edges rough against her trembling fingers, and stared at the lantern's tiny, unwavering flame. Her father's handwriting was unmistakable. She had seen it countless times in birthday cards and grocery lists. In the old journals he kept locked away in his study. But he was gone. He had been gone for a decade. The message, "You can never leave," echoed in her mind, each word a cold weight pressing down on her. She wanted to believe it was a cruel joke, some elaborate prank by the townsfolk, but the fear in her mother's eyes told her otherwise. Ruth stood in the doorway, her nightgown fluttering in the morning breeze, her face pale and drawn. "Did you see them?" Ruth whispered, her voice barely audible. Emma shook her head.
No.
I heard his voice, Dad's voice, and then this." She held up the parchment. Ruth's lips trembled. "They come every year, Emma. The ones we've lost. They come back, but they're not themselves. They want us to join them." Emma's mind raced. She remembered the stories she'd heard as a child, stories of neighbors who vanished on the 7th of July, of strange lights in the woods, of voices calling from the darkness. She'd always dismissed them as superstition, the product of overactive imaginations and small-town gossip. But now, faced with the evidence in her own hands, she couldn't deny the truth. She spent the morning in a daze, moving through the house as if in a dream. The town was eerily quiet, the usual bustle of daily life replaced by an uneasy stillness. The lanterns from the night before still hung from the trees, their glass panes smudged with soot. Emma watched as a group of townsfolk gathered in the square, their faces grim, their voices hushed. She approached cautiously, the parchment folded tightly in her pocket. As she drew near, she recognized Mr. Hargrove, the town's oldest resident, standing at the center of the group. His white hair gleamed in the sunlight, and his hands shook as he addressed the crowd. "It happened again," he said, his voice rough with age. "The woods took another one last night. Young Tommy Granger. His mother found his bed empty this morning." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Emma felt a chill run down her spine. She remembered Tommy, a quiet boy with a shy smile, always trailing behind his older siblings. He couldn't have been more than 12. "We all know the rules," Mr. Hargrove continued, his gaze sweeping over the assembled faces. "We light the lanterns, we stay inside, and we don't answer the door. But it's getting worse. Every year the voices get louder. The lights get closer." Emma felt a surge of anger. "Why do we let this happen?" she demanded, her voice sharper than she intended. "Why don't we do something?" The crowd turned to her, their expressions a mix of fear and resignation. Mr. Hargrove sighed. "We've tried, Emma. We've tried everything. But the woods, they remember, they hold grudges, and they don't let go." Emma clenched her fists, frustration burning in her chest. She refused to accept that there was nothing they could do. She spent the rest of the day searching for answers, poring over her father's old journals and town records. She found references to the 7th of July stretching back centuries, accounts of disappearances, strange lights, and voices in the night. The pattern was undeniable. As dusk approached, Emma made a decision. She would face the woods herself. She would find out what lurked in the shadows and put an end to the cycle of fear. Her mother tried to stop her. "You don't understand, Emma. They'll take you too." Emma hugged her tightly. "I have to try, Mom. I can't live like this, waiting for the next person to vanish. I need to know the truth." She packed a flashlight, a notebook, and her father's old hunting knife. As the sun dipped below the horizon, she slipped out of the house and made her way to the edge of the woods. The trees loomed overhead, their branches tangled like grasping fingers. The air was thick with the scent of moss and decay. She paused at the tree line, her heart pounding. The lanterns flickered in the distance, casting long, wavering shadows. She took a deep breath and stepped into the darkness. The woods were silent, save for the crunch of leaves beneath her boots. Emma moved cautiously, her flashlight beam cutting through the gloom. She followed the faint trail of lanterns, their light growing dimmer the deeper she ventured. After what felt like hours, she came to a clearing. In the center stood a circle of stones, each one carved with strange symbols. The lanterns were arranged around the stones, their flames flickering in the wind. Emma approached cautiously, her senses alert. As she examined the stones, she felt a sudden chill. The air grew heavy, and the shadows seemed to shift and writhe. She heard a whisper, a soft, mournful sound that sent shivers down her spine. "Emma!" She spun around, her flashlight trembling in her hand. The shadows coalesced into a figure, a tall, gaunt man with hollow eyes and a twisted smile. His face was familiar yet wrong. It was her father, but distorted, as if seen through a broken mirror. "Dad?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. The figure stepped closer, its movements jerky and unnatural. "You shouldn't have come here," it rasped. "You belong to the woods now." Emma backed away, her heart racing. She remembered her mother's warning. They come back, but they're not themselves. She gripped the hunting knife, her knuckles white. The figure lunged, its mouth opening in a silent scream. Emma slashed at it with the knife, the blade passing through its form like smoke. The figure dissolved into shadows, swirling around her in a suffocating embrace. She gasped for air, her vision blurring. The whispers grew louder, overlapping in a cacophony of voices. "Join us, stay with us, never leave." Emma fought to stay conscious, her mind reeling. She focused on her father's handwriting, the message on the parchment. "You can never leave." With a surge of willpower, she broke free from the shadows and stumbled out of the clearing. She ran through the woods, branches tearing at her clothes, the whispers chasing her every step. She burst into the open, gasping for breath. The town's lanterns glowed in the distance, a beacon of safety. She collapsed on the grass, tears streaming down her face. As she caught her breath, she realized the truth. The woods were alive, hungry for the souls of the lost. The lanterns were not just a tradition. They were a warning, a desperate attempt to keep the darkness at bay. Emma knew she couldn't stay in Willow's End. But as she looked at the town, she understood her father's message. You can never leave. The woods would always be there, waiting, watching. And every 7th of July, the shadows would return. The days that followed Emma's flight from the woods blurred together in a haze of exhaustion and dread. She barely slept, haunted by nightmares of twisted faces and grasping shadows. Each time she closed her eyes, she was back in the clearing, surrounded by the voices of the lost. Her father's distorted smile lingered at the edge of her vision, a constant reminder of what she had seen. Ruth watched her daughter with growing concern. She brewed strong tea and pressed cool cloths to Emma's forehead, whispering old prayers under her breath. "You're lucky to have come back," she said one evening, her voice trembling. "Most don't. The woods let you go for a reason." Emma tried to make sense of it all. She pored over her father's journals, searching for clues. Anything that might explain why the woods had chosen her, why she had been allowed to escape when so many others had not. The entries grew increasingly erratic in the years before his death, filled with frantic sketches of the stone circle and cryptic warnings. The boundary weakens. The debt must be paid. One night, as Emma sat at the kitchen table, she heard a soft knock at the door. She froze, her heart pounding. It was only 10 p.m., not the witching hour, but late enough to set her nerves on edge. She glanced at her mother, who nodded grimly and handed her a lantern. Emma approached the door, her hand trembling as she gripped the handle. She peered through the peephole and saw a familiar face. Mrs. Granger, Tommy's mother. Her eyes were red-rimmed, her hair disheveled. Emma opened the door a crack. "Mrs. Granger?" The woman's voice was barely more than a whisper. "Have you seen him? Have you seen my boy?" Emma shook her head, guilt twisting in her stomach. "No, I'm sorry. I haven't." Mrs. Granger's eyes filled with tears. "They say you went into the woods. They say you saw things. Please, Emma, if there's anything you can tell me, anything at all." Emma hesitated. She wanted to help, But how could she explain what she had seen? How could she tell this grieving mother that her son was lost to the shadows, that the woods had claimed him as they had claimed so many before? "I'm sorry," Emma said again, her voice breaking. "I wish I could help." Mrs. Granger nodded, her shoulders slumping. She turned and disappeared into the night, her lantern bobbing in the darkness. Emma closed the door and leaned against it, fighting back tears. She felt helpless, trapped in a cycle of fear and loss that had gripped Willow's End for generations. The next morning, Emma made a decision. She couldn't save Tommy or the others who had vanished, but perhaps she could break the cycle. She gathered her father's journals, her own notes, and the lantern with the parchment. She would confront the town council and demand answers. The council met in the old church, its stone walls cold and unyielding. The members sat in a semicircle, their faces grave. Mr. Hargrove presided, his hands folded on the table. Emma stood before them, her voice steady despite her fear. "We can't keep living like this. Every year we lose someone else. We light the lanterns, we say the prayers, but it's not enough. We need to know the truth. What happened here? Why does the woods take our people?" The council members exchanged uneasy glances. Finally, Mr. Hargrove spoke. "You're not the first to ask these questions, Emma, but the answers are not easy to hear." He gestured for her to sit. The other council members leaned in, their expression solemn. "It began in 1787, Mr. Hargrove said, his voice low. "The founders of Willow's End settled here on land that was not empty. The woods were sacred to the people who came before us. The settlers took what they wanted, cut down trees, built homes. But they disturbed something old and angry." Emma listened, her heart pounding. She had always suspected there was more to the town's history than the sanitized version taught in school. "The first disappearances happened that summer," Mr. Hargrove continued. "Children, mostly. The settlers tried to fight back, but the woods would not be tamed. Eventually, they made a bargain. Every year, on the 7th of July, a soul would be taken. In exchange, the town would be spared." Emma's blood ran cold. "A sacrifice." Mr. Hargrove nodded. "We don't choose who goes. The woods do. All we can do is try to protect ourselves, to honor the old traditions. But the debt remains." Emma stared at the council, anger and despair warring within her. "We can't keep sacrificing our children. There has to be another way." Mr. Hargrove's eyes were sad. "We've tried, Emma. We've tried to leave, but the woods follow. We've tried to fight, but the shadows are stronger. All we can do is endure." Emma left the church feeling more hopeless than ever. She wandered the town, the weight of history pressing down on her. The lanterns seemed dimmer, their light barely holding back the encroaching darkness. That night, as she lay in bed, Emma made a vow. She would not let the woods claim anyone else. She would find a way to break the curse, even if it meant facing the shadows herself. As midnight approached, she rose from her bed and lit her lantern. She slipped out of the house, her mother's soft snores echoing behind her. The town was silent, the only sound the rustle of leaves in the wind. Emma walked to the edge of the woods, her heart pounding. She held the lantern high, its flame flickering in the darkness. "I'm not afraid of you," she whispered. "You can't have us anymore." The shadows stirred, and the whispers began. But this time Emma stood her ground. She would not run. She would not hide. She stepped into the woods, determined to face whatever waited in the darkness. The air in the woods was thick and cold, swallowing the light from Emma's lantern as she pressed deeper into the trees. Each step felt heavier than the last, as though the earth itself were reluctant to let her pass. The familiar path she'd followed the night before seemed to twist and shift, leading her in circles, but Emma pressed on, her resolve hardening with every whispered taunt from the darkness. She could feel the eyes of the woods upon her, watchful, hungry, and ancient. The voices grew louder, overlapping in a chorus of longing and accusation. "Emma! Emma!" they called, some pleading, some mocking, some sounding so much like her father that her heart ached. She reached the clearing again, the circle of stones looming out of the mist. The lanterns from the previous night had gone out, but the stones themselves glowed faintly, etched runes pulsing with a sickly green light. Emma's breath caught in her throat. She knelt beside the nearest stone, running her fingers over the carvings. The symbols were older than English, older than any language she knew, but as she traced them, she felt a strange sense of recognition, as if the knowledge were buried deep within her bones. A sudden gust of wind snuffed out her lantern. For a moment, she was plunged into absolute darkness. Then, slowly, the clearing filled with a pale, unnatural glow. Shadows gathered at the edge of the stones, coalescing into shapes, figures, dozens of them, faces twisted in sorrow and rage. Emma recognized some of them. Neighbors who had vanished over the years, children she'd played with as a girl, even old Mrs. Granger, her eyes hollow and accusing. At the center of the circle stood her father, his form more solid than the others, his eyes fixed on Emma. "Why did you come back?" he asked, his voice echoing with pain. Emma's throat tightened. "I had to. Couldn't let it go on. I couldn't let anyone else be taken." Her father shook his head. "You don't understand. The bargain cannot be broken. The woods demand a soul. If they do not get one, they will take many." Emma's mind raced. There has to be a way. There has to be something we can do. The shadows pressed closer, their whispers growing frantic. Join us, set us free." Emma looked at her father, desperation in her eyes. "Tell me what to do, please." He hesitated, his form flickering. "There is a way, but it is dangerous. The woods feed on fear and guilt. If you face them without fear, if you offer yourself freely, you may be able to break the cycle. But you must be willing to stay. You must become the guardian." Emma's heart pounded. The guardian? Her father nodded. Someone must watch over the woods, keep the balance. The bargain was made because the settlers destroyed the old guardians. If you take their place, the woods may be appeased. Emma's mind reeled. She thought of her mother, of the families who had lost loved ones, of the children who would grow up in fear. She thought of her own life, the dreams she'd left behind. Could she give it all up to save the town? She looked at the faces around her, at the hope and despair in their eyes. She took a deep breath and stepped into the center of the circle. "I will do it," she said, her voice steady. "I will be the guardian." The shadows surged forward, enveloping her in a cold embrace. Emma felt herself falling, sinking into the earth. The voices faded, replaced by a deep, resonant silence. She felt the weight of the woods settle upon her, ancient and implacable. She opened her eyes and found herself standing at the edge of the clearing. The stones were silent, their runes dark. The lanterns flickered back to life, casting a warm, golden light. The shadows had vanished. Emma felt different, stronger, older, connected to the land in a way she had never known. She understood now. The woods were not evil, only wounded. They needed a guardian, someone to protect them and the town from each other. She walked back to Willow's End as the first light of dawn broke through the trees. The town was waking, the fear of the night fading with the darkness. Emma's mother met her at the door, tears streaming down her face. Emma hugged her tightly. "It's over, Mom. The woods have what they need. No one else will be taken." Ruth wept with relief, holding her daughter as if she would never let go. In the days that followed, the town changed. The lanterns were still lit on the 7th of July, but now they were symbols of hope, not fear. The disappearances stopped. The woods grew quieter, more peaceful. Emma remained in Willow's End, tending to the land, watching over the town. She felt the presence of the old guardians, guiding her, teaching her the ways of the woods. She was never alone, and every year on the 7th of July, she walked to the edge of the forest and lit a lantern, a beacon for the lost and a promise to the living. The shadows would never claim Willow's End again. But sometimes, late at night, Emma heard the whispers of the woods, reminding her of the price she had paid, and the duty she would carry for the rest of her days. The years passed quietly in Willow's End. The 7th of July became a day of remembrance rather than dread. Its somber rituals transformed into gentle celebrations of life and gratitude. Emma Caldwell, once the restless daughter who fled the town's shadows, became its quiet guardian. She lived on the edge of the woods in her family's old house, her presence a comfort to the townspeople and a silent promise to the ancient spirits of the forest. Emma's role as guardian was not one of isolation, but of deep connection. She learned the rhythms of the land, the way the mist curled through the trees at dawn, the songs of the birds that nested in the oaks, the subtle shifts in the wind that foretold change. She tended to the old graves and the stone circle, keeping the runes clear of moss and the lanterns polished and ready. The woods, once a place of terror, became her companion, its secrets unfolding to her in dreams and quiet moments. Each 7th of July, Emma would rise before the sun and walk the familiar path to the clearing. She would light a lantern at the center of the stone circle and sit in silence, listening to the whispers of those who had come before. Sometimes, she felt her father's presence, a gentle warmth on her shoulder, a fleeting glimpse of his smile in the morning light. Other times, she heard the laughter of children, the voices of old friends, all woven into the fabric of the woods. The townsfolk came to trust Emma's wisdom. They sought her counsel in times of trouble, brought her gifts of bread and honey, and left offerings at the edge of the forest. Children grew up hearing her stories, learning to respect the woods and honor the old traditions. The fear that had once gripped Willow's End faded, replaced by a quiet reverence for the land and its mysteries. But Emma knew that peace was fragile. The woods still remembered the pain of the past, and the balance she maintained was delicate. There were nights when the wind howled through the trees and the shadows grew restless. On those nights, Emma would walk the boundary of the forest, lantern in hand, whispering words of comfort and reassurance. She reminded the woods that the bargain had been honored, that the town and the forest could coexist in harmony. One summer, a stranger arrived in Willow's End, a young woman named Alice, drawn by tales of the town's peculiar history. She was curious and bold, much like Emma had been in her youth. Alice asked questions, explored the woods, and soon became a fixture in the community. Emma saw something of herself in Alice, a restless spirit searching for meaning. One evening, as the 7th of July approached, Alice found Emma in the clearing, tending to the stones. "Do you ever regret it?" Alice asked, her voice soft. "Giving up your old life to stay here?" Emma smiled, her eyes reflecting the lantern's golden glow. "Sometimes, but I know this is where I'm meant to be. The woods needed a guardian, and I needed a purpose. We found each other." Alice nodded, understanding more than words could say. She helped Emma light the lanterns, their flames dancing in the twilight. Together, they watched as the townsfolk gathered, their faces illuminated by hope rather than fear. As darkness fell, Emma felt the familiar presence of the woods, ancient, watchful, and at peace. She closed her eyes and listened to the silence, broken only by the gentle rustle of leaves and the distant laughter of children. For the first time in generations, the 7th of July was a night of joy. The townspeople sang songs and shared stories, their voices rising above the trees. The lanterns burned bright, casting away the last remnants of shadow. Emma stood at the edge of the clearing, her heart full. She knew that her watch would never truly end, that the woods would always need a guardian. But she also knew that she was not alone. The people of Willow's End had found their courage, and the woods had found their peace. As the first light of dawn crept over the horizon, Emma whispered a promise to the woods and to herself. "I will watch, I will remember, and I will protect." The woods answered with a gentle sigh, a breeze that carried the scent of wildflowers and old secrets. Emma smiled, knowing that the shadows of independence had finally faded, replaced by a new legacy, one of hope, healing, and harmony. And so, the story of Willow's End and its guardian became legend. A true tale whispered on the 7th of July, a reminder that even the darkest bargains can be broken, and that courage can turn fear into light. The 7th of July was the hottest day of the year in the small town of Merrow Creek, and the air shimmered with the promise of thunderstorms. The townsfolk moved slowly, seeking shade beneath the ancient maples that lined the main street, their roots curling like fingers through the cracked sidewalks. The oppressive heat seemed to press time into a slow crawl, except for 1 hour just before midnight, when time itself was said to vanish. For as long as anyone could remember, there had been stories about the lost hour on July 7th. At 11:11 p.m., clocks would stop, watches would freeze, and for exactly 60 minutes, Merrow Creek would slip into a silence so profound it was as if the world had forgotten it existed. Most people dismissed it as folklore, a ghost story for children. But every family in town had a tale of someone who'd vanished during that hour, someone who'd stepped outside and never returned. 17-year-old Caleb Foster had heard the stories all his life. His grandmother, a stern woman with sharp eyes and a sharper tongue, claimed she'd lost her brother to the lost hour when she was a girl. He went to fetch water from the well, she'd say, and when the hour ended, all that was left was his bucket, spinning on the rope. Caleb's friends laughed it off, but he'd always felt a chill whenever the subject came up. This year, the 7th of July fell on a Friday. Caleb spent the day working at the hardware store, stocking shelves and sweeping dust from the aisles. The owner, Mr. Beale, kept glancing at the clock, his hands trembling as the hour grew late. "You best get home before dark," he warned Caleb as he locked up.
"No sensatamting fata."
Caleb shrugged off the warning, but as he walked home beneath the bruised purple sky, he couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The town felt emptier than usual. Windows were shuttered, and the only sounds were the distant rumble of thunder and the whisper of wind through the trees. His house stood at the edge of town, a weathered two-story with peeling paint and a sagging porch. Inside, his mother was setting the table for dinner, her face drawn with worry. Caleb's little sister, Lily, sat on the floor, coloring pictures of monsters and ghosts. "Be inside before 11, his mother said, her voice tight. "And don't let Lily out of your sight." Caleb rolled his eyes but nodded. After dinner, the family gathered in the living room, the air thick with unspoken fear. The clock on the mantel ticked steadily toward 11, each second louder than the last. At 10:55, Caleb's phone buzzed. A message from his best friend, Mason. "Meet me at the old playground. I want to see if the lost hour is real." Caleb hesitated. He glanced at his mother, who was dozing in her chair, and at Lily, who had fallen asleep on the rug. The urge to prove the stories wrong, to show Mason that he wasn't afraid, was too strong to resist. He slipped out the back door, the screen creaking behind him. The night was heavy with the scent of rain, and lightning flickered on the horizon. The playground was only a few blocks away, its rusted swings and broken slide silhouetted against the sky. Mason was waiting by the merry-go-round, his face pale in the moonlight. "You came," he said, relief and excitement warring in his voice. "Yeah," Caleb replied, trying to sound braver than he felt. "Let's get this over with." They sat on the swings, watching the clock on Caleb's phone tick closer to 11:11. The world seemed to hold its breath. At exactly 11:11, the air grew cold, and the sounds of the night faded away. The crickets stopped chirping, the wind died, and even the distant thunder went silent. Caleb glanced at his phone. The screen was frozen, the numbers locked at 11:11. Mason's watch had stopped, its second hand trembling. A strange hush settled over the playground. The shadows grew longer, stretching toward the boys like grasping hands. Caleb's heart pounded in his chest. "Do you feel that?" he whispered. Mason nodded, his eyes wide. "It's like we're the only ones left." They stood, nerves jangling, and started to walk home. But with every step, the world seemed to shift. The streets were unfamiliar, the houses twisted and wrong. The trees leaned over the road, their branches tangled like webs. "Something's not right," Mason said, his voice barely audible. Caleb tried to retrace their steps, but the path kept changing. The playground was gone, replaced by a dense thicket of trees. The air was thick with fog, and the silence was absolute. Suddenly, a figure appeared in the mist. A tall, thin man with a face like a cracked mask. His eyes were empty, and his mouth stretched into a broken smile. "Welcome to the Lost Hour," he whispered, his voice echoing in the stillness. "You shouldn't have come here." Caleb and Mason backed away, but the figure followed, his footsteps silent on the ground. The fog closed in, and the boys were swallowed by the darkness. The last thing Caleb saw before the world went black was the man's smile, wide and hungry. When the clock started again at 12:11, the playground was empty. Caleb's phone buzzed back to life, but there was no sign of the boys. Only a single swing moved, creaking in the wind, as if someone had just let go. In Merrow Creek, the legend of the lost hour grew stronger. And every 7th of July, as the clocks ticked toward 11:11, the townsfolk locked their doors and prayed that time would forget them just one more year. The next morning, Merrow Creek woke to a heavy, unnatural silence. The air was thick with humidity and something else, an absence, a sense that something vital had been plucked from the world. Caleb's mother found his bed empty, the sheets cool and undisturbed. She called for him, her voice echoing through the house, but only Lily answered, rubbing sleep from her eyes. Across town, Mason's parents experienced the same dread. His shoes were by the door, his phone charger still plugged in, but Mason was gone. When the two mothers spoke on the phone, their voices trembled with fear and guilt. They both knew the stories. They both knew what day it was. By noon, the whole town was searching. Some combed the woods, others checked the riverbanks. The sheriff, a practical man who didn't believe in ghost stories, organized search parties and questioned neighbors. But as the hours passed and the sun climbed higher, hope began to wither. Lily, clutching her favorite stuffed rabbit, watched the grown-ups from the porch. She remembered seeing Caleb leave the night before, remembered the worry in his eyes. She remembered the stories her grandmother had told, about the lost hour and the things that waited in the dark. She was only 8, but she understood more than the adults realized. That night, as the searchers returned empty-handed, Lily crept into Caleb's room. She sat on his bed, tracing the patterns on his pillowcase, and whispered, "Come home, Caleb. Please come home." But Caleb was far away, trapped in a world that existed only during the lost hour. He woke in darkness, the air cold and damp. Mason was beside him, curled up on the ground, shivering. The fog was gone, replaced by a heavy gloom. The trees were taller here, their trunks twisted and blackened, their branches clawing at the sky. The ground was soft and spongy, covered in a thick layer of moss that glowed faintly in the darkness. Caleb sat up, his head pounding. "Mason, are you awake?" Mason groaned and opened his eyes. "Where are we?" "I don't know," Caleb whispered, "but we have to get out of here." They stood and looked around. The world was silent, except for the distant sound of water dripping. There was no sign of the playground, no sign of Merrow Creek. Only the endless forest, stretching in every direction. They walked for what felt like hours, calling for help, but their voices were swallowed by the trees. The darkness pressed in on them, thick and suffocating. Caleb's phone was dead, its screen cracked. Mason's watch was still frozen at 11:11. As they stumbled through the woods, they began to notice strange things. Shapes moving in the shadows, faces peering from behind the trees, whispers that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The boys clung to each other, their fear growing with every step. Eventually, they came to a clearing. In the center stood an old well, its stones slick with moss. The bucket hung from a frayed rope, spinning slowly. Caleb felt a chill run down his spine. He remembered his grandmother's story, her brother, the well, the lost hour. Mason approached the well, peering into the darkness below. "Do you think there's water?" Caleb shook his head. "I don't think we should touch it." But Mason was thirsty, his lips cracked and dry. He reached for the bucket, but as soon as his fingers brushed the handle, the air grew colder. The ground trembled, and a low, mournful wail rose from the depths of the well. The boys staggered back as a figure emerged from the darkness. A boy no older than 12, his clothes tattered and his skin pale as moonlight. His eyes were empty, his mouth twisted in a silent scream. Caleb recognized him from an old photograph in his grandmother's house. That's her brother," he whispered. The ghostly boy reached out, his fingers long and thin. "Help me," he pleaded, his voice echoing in the stillness. "I'm lost. We're all lost." Shapes began to gather at the edge of the clearing. Other children, their faces familiar and strange, their eyes hollow. They moved in silence, their feet barely touching the ground. Mason grabbed Caleb's arm. "We have to go. Now." They ran, the ghostly children following, their whispers growing louder. "Stay with us. Don't leave. It's safer here." Caleb and Mason burst through the trees, stumbling into another clearing. This one was filled with broken toys. Dolls with missing eyes, rusted tricycles, deflated balls. The air was thick with the scent of mildew and decay. At the center of the clearing stood the tall, thin man with the cracked mask. He watched them with empty eyes, his smile wider than before. "You can't leave," he said softly. "Not until the hour is over. Not until you've made a choice." Caleb's voice shook. "What choice?" The man tilted his head. "One of you must stay. The other may go. That is the rule of the lost hour." Mason stared in horror.
No.
"That's not fair." The man's smile never faltered. "Fairness has nothing to do with it. The lost hour demands a soul. It always has. It always will." The boys looked at each other, terror and disbelief in their eyes. The ghostly children circled closer, their whispers rising in a mournful chorus. Caleb felt a cold hand close around his heart. He thought of his mother, of Lily, of all the people who had vanished over the years. He realized, with a sick certainty, that the stories were true. The lost hour was real, and it would not let them go without a price. The clock was ticking, even if they couldn't hear it. The choice had to be made. Caleb's heart hammered in his chest as the tall, thin man's words echoed through the clearing. The ghostly children pressed closer, their faces pale and pleading, their whispers swirling through the air like a cold wind. Mason's hand trembled in Caleb's grasp, but neither boy let go. "One of you must stay," the man repeated, his voice flat and final. "The other may return. The lost hour always demands a soul." Caleb looked at Mason, panic and disbelief warring in his eyes. "We can't do this. There has to be another way." Mason shook his head, tears streaking his cheeks. "I don't want to die here, Caleb. I don't want you to either." The ghostly children circled them, their whispers growing louder, more insistent. "Stay, stay, stay with us." Caleb remembered his grandmother's stories, how her brother had vanished, how the well had become a place of mourning. He remembered Lily's face that morning, the way she'd clutched her rabbit and watched the searchers with silent understanding. He thought of his mother, waiting at home, hoping for a miracle. The tall man stepped closer, his mask cracking further as he smiled. "The hour is almost over. The choice must be made." Caleb's mind raced. He searched the clearing for anything, any sign, any loophole, any hope. The toys scattered in the grass seemed to shimmer in the half-light, each one a relic of a lost child. He realized, with a jolt, that the lost hour was built on sorrow and memory. It fed on the pain of those left behind. He turned to Mason. Maybe if we don't choose, it can't take either of us. Maybe we just have to hold on." Mason's eyes widened. "But what if it takes us both?" Caleb swallowed hard. Then at least we tried. The man's smile faded. For the first time, a flicker of uncertainty crossed his face. The rules must be followed. Caleb squeezed Mason's hand. We're not choosing. We're staying together. The ghostly children wailed, their voices rising in a mournful chorus. The clearing trembled, the air thick with grief and longing. The man raised his hands, and the world seemed to tilt, the ground shifting beneath their feet. Suddenly, Lily's voice cut through the chaos. A clear, bright plea carried on the wind. Come home, Caleb. Please come home. The sound pierced the gloom, and for a moment, the lost hour faltered. The ghostly children hesitated, their eyes turning toward the sound. The tall man's mask cracked, a jagged line splitting his face. Caleb felt a surge of hope. He shouted into the darkness, "We want to go home. We don't belong here." The clearing erupted in a blinding light. The ghostly children screamed, their forms dissolving into mist. The man staggered, his mask shattering, revealing empty darkness beneath. Caleb and Mason clung to each other as the world spun around them. The light grew brighter, burning away the shadows, until there was nothing but silence. When Caleb opened his eyes, he was lying in the grass beside the playground. Mason was beside him, blinking in confusion. The sky was pale with the first light of dawn, and the air was warm and sweet. Caleb's phone buzzed in his pocket. 6:12 a.m. The lost hour was over. They staggered home, exhausted and shaken. Their mothers wept with relief, holding them close and whispering prayers of gratitude. Lily hugged Caleb, her eyes shining with tears. The story of the lost hour changed that year. No longer just a tale of loss, it became a story of hope, a reminder that love and courage could break even the oldest curses. But deep in the woods by the old well, the wind sometimes carried the sound of children's laughter, and the faint, broken whisper of a man who had once ruled the lost hour, waiting for the day when the rules might change again. The return of Caleb and Mason sent ripples through Marrow Creek. The boys' survival, after vanishing during the lost hour, became the talk of the town, whispered about in kitchens and on porches. Some called it a miracle, others a hoax, but Caleb and Mason knew the truth. They bore the memory of that haunted place, the ghostly children, and the man with the cracked mask. The experience left them changed in ways they couldn't yet understand. For days, Caleb felt the weight of the lost hour pressing on him. At night, he dreamed of the clearing, the well, and the children's hollow eyes. He woke with the sensation of moss under his fingers and the echo of Lily's voice calling him home. Mason, too, grew quiet and withdrawn, his laughter subdued. They met in secret, trying to make sense of what had happened. One afternoon, the boys sat beneath the old maple tree by the playground, the summer sun dappling the grass. Mason fidgeted with a stick, drawing circles in the dirt. "Do you think it's really over?" he asked. Caleb shook his head. "I don't know. It felt like something changed. But I still feel it, like it's watching us." Mason shivered. "I keep seeing them, the kids, in my dreams. Sometimes I hear them whisper my name." Caleb nodded. "Me too." They decided to visit the well in the woods, hoping to find answers or at least some closure. They waited until dusk, when the air was cool and the shadows long. The woods were quiet, the hush broken only by the distant call of a whippoorwill. They followed the winding path, their footsteps muffled by moss and fallen leaves. The well looked the same as in their memory. Ancient stones, slick with moss, the rope frayed and the bucket still spinning slowly. Caleb knelt beside it, peering into the darkness. He felt a strange pull, as if the well were alive, watching him. He called softly, "Are you still there?" For a long moment, there was only silence. Then, from deep within the well, a faint voice answered. A child's voice, trembling and distant. "Thank you." Mason stepped back, his eyes wide. "Did you hear that?" Caleb nodded. I think we set them free. The kids. Maybe not all of them, but some. They sat by the well, listening to the wind rustling through the trees. Caleb felt a sense of peace he hadn't known since before the lost hour. He realized that their refusal to choose, their determination to hold on to each other, had broken the old rule. The lost hour had always demanded a sacrifice, but love and loyalty had rewritten the story. As they walked back to town, they talked about what they'd seen. They promised to remember the children, to tell their story so no one would forget. Mason suggested they return every year on the 7th of July, to light a candle by the well and say a prayer for the lost. The next July, they kept their promise. They brought Lily with them, and together they placed a small lantern on the well's edge. The light flickered in the darkness, a beacon of hope for any souls still wandering the lost hour. Word spread through Merrow Creek, and soon others joined them. The annual gathering became a new tradition, a night of remembrance and courage. The townsfolk shared stories, sang songs, and left offerings for the lost. The fear that had haunted the town for generations slowly faded, replaced by a sense of unity and resilience. Caleb's grandmother watched with pride, her eyes bright with unshed tears. She hugged Caleb tightly, whispering, "You did what none of us could. You brought them home." But even as the town healed, Caleb knew the lost hour was not gone forever. The well remained, a silent sentinel at the edge of the woods. Sometimes, late at night, he would hear the faint sound of laughter or the echo of a broken whisper. He understood now that the lost hour was part of Merrow Creek's story, a shadow that would always linger at the edge of the light. He also understood that the real power lay not in fear, but in the bonds they shared. As long as they remembered, as long as they stood together, the lost hour could never claim them again. And so, on each 7th of July, as the clocks ticked toward 11:11, the people of Merrow Creek gathered by the well. They lit lanterns, held hands, and faced the darkness with open hearts. The lost hour still came, but it found no fear, only love and remembrance. Caleb stood at the edge of the clearing, Lily's hand in his, Mason at his side. He looked up at the sky, the stars bright and unwavering, and whispered a promise to the night. "We will always remember. We will always come home." The years slipped by, and the story of the lost hour became woven into the fabric of Merrow Creek. What was once a whispered warning transformed into a tale of courage and community, retold each July as the lanterns glowed softly in the night. Caleb, Mason, and Lily grew up with the memory of that night etched into their souls, a memory that shaped who they would become. Caleb's life was forever marked by the lost hour, but not in the way he once feared. He grew into a thoughtful, steady young man, respected by the townsfolk for his quiet strength. Mason, once haunted by nightmares, found solace in art, painting vivid scenes of the woods, the well, and the children they'd freed. Lily, curious and brave, became the keeper of the lost hour stories, sharing them with new generations who gathered each summer to listen. Every July 7th, as dusk fell, the people of Merrow Creek would gather at the edge of the woods. They carried lanterns and candles, their faces illuminated by hope and remembrance. The well, once a symbol of loss, became a place of gathering and healing. Families picnicked on the grass, children played tag among the trees, and elders shared memories of those who had vanished long ago. Caleb and Mason led the procession each year, lighting the first lantern and placing it on the well's mossy stones. Lily would read aloud the names of the lost, her voice clear and steady in the warm summer air. The townsfolk would stand in silence, heads bowed, as the lanterns flickered and the shadows danced. One year, as the ceremony ended and the crowd began to disperse, Lily lingered by the well. She traced her fingers over the rough stones, feeling the pulse of old magic beneath her skin. She closed her eyes and listened to the night, the chirp of crickets, the rustle of leaves, and, just for a moment, the distant sound of children's laughter. She felt a presence beside her and turned to find Caleb watching her, a gentle smile on his lips. "Do you ever wonder if they're really gone?" she asked softly. Caleb nodded, I think they're at peace now, but I also think they're still part of this place. Part of us. Lily smiled, comforted by his words. I hope they know we remember them. They do, Caleb said, squeezing her hand. We made sure of it. As the years passed, the lost hour faded from the realm of fear and legend, becoming instead a story of redemption. New families moved to Marrow Creek, drawn by its beauty and sense of community. The old fears lingered only in the corners of memory, softened by time and tradition. But every so often, on a quiet summer night, someone would glimpse a flicker of movement in the woods, a shadow darting between the trees, a flash of white in the moonlight. Some said it was just the wind, or a deer startled by the lanterns. Others believed it was the spirits of the lost children, watching over the town that had finally remembered them. Caleb grew older, married, and had children of his own. He taught them the story of the lost hour, not as a warning, but as a lesson. That courage and love could break even the oldest curses, and that no one was ever truly lost as long as they were remembered. Mason's paintings hung in the town hall, a vibrant testament to the night that changed everything. Lily became a teacher, her classroom filled with drawings of lanterns, wells, and brave children standing hand in hand. On the 50th anniversary of the Lost Hour's breaking, the entire town gathered for a celebration. Lanterns lined every street, and music filled the air. Caleb, now an old man, stood by the well with Mason and Lily, their hair silver in the lantern light. As midnight approached, Caleb looked out over the crowd and felt a deep sense of peace. The lost hour had not vanished. It had been transformed. Its shadow had become a source of unity, its sorrow a wellspring of hope. He closed his eyes and whispered a final promise to the night. We will always remember. We will always come home. And somewhere, deep in the woods, the wind carried his words, weaving them into the leaves and the earth, ensuring that the lost hour would never claim another soul. Because Marrow Creek had learned the power of remembrance and the strength of standing together in the face of darkness. If these stories kept you on the edge of your seat, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share for more true horror. What would you do if you faced the 7th of July curse? Let me know in the comments. See you in the next nightmare.